Well, Tyler, summer is rapidly approaching, even though it hasn't felt like it for us here in the Northeast for the last couple weeks. It's been cold and rainy,
I feel like it's
but
only rapidly approaching because we haven't recorded in a month.
we have not recorded in a while because we did end up combining a bunch of big episodes, and in the U.S. we had a holiday this past weekend, so we just
Yeah,
took it
we're,
off, and
we're at least 2 weeks
yeah, and we're low.
without recording.
To be fair, we've both been quite busy these last couple weeks.
That's always the excuse, is we're quite
Yeah,
busy.
I know. This is
Well,
not our
to be
day
fair,
job.
we took two of the business people in the county and said, hey, let's do a podcast.
Yeah, honestly. It took two. Yeah, we're like, oh, yeah, we definitely have free time to do this. When we first started, we had a lot more free time,
Not really.
more than we do now. And it was not much. But welcome, everybody, to Life the Complete Story. I know you don't want to listen to us gripe about our own, I don't want to say laziness because it's not like we didn't want to record, but our own
Our
struggles.
laziness only comes in when we have to write notes. When we record, we're not
Yeah,
lazy, but note taking is
correct.
completely different. But hello,
Correct.
everybody. Welcome back to Life the Complete Story. I am your host, Tyler, joined by my lovely co host, Alex. And today we have quite the episode. We're switching up. We're done with catfish. I know it.
Thank goodness.
Doing
As
it.
much as cool as they were, I'm glad we're done.
It took us 3 weeks to record the catfish episode. In case you didn't know, it's 3 hours long, but it's really interesting. Lots of excitement, lots of cool things going on. But today we are talking about something a little bit different. We have jumped from the freshwater to the saltwater. We're back in the marine ecosystems, talking about Argentiniforms today. We'll get into them a little bit later, but we'll start as we always start with our Nature in the News. Today we have an article from the University of Texas at Austin. So there's a big debate here on like the order of things and how they came to be and who's ancestor. So the widely known ancestor to most tetrapods is Tiktaalik, which is kind of this really cool little dude. For reference, as I open in a new tab, share screen, bing bing bing. Our little dude, Tiktaalik, kind of like salamander-ish, but doesn't quite have legs, still has like flipper
Flippers, but
fin things,
not
like you can see the rays and everything. Doesn't quite have the toesy woesies like we think of in salamanders.
little tootsies.
Yeah. So with that, we are doing some new research here. Uh, we have, this is back in 1984. We found this species. It's called Westlothiana liziae, one of the earliest examples of a four-legged animal that kind of evolved from living underwater to being terrestrial. So I didn't really quite read this article as much as I should have before I started doing research. Um, but basically, what I'm understanding of it is this is like the next step after one of the next steps after TikTok. I'm sure that TikTok kind of came up in many places throughout the world, and as such, kind of had divergent evolution in different areas where it came to be.
Yeah, so it looks like, just scanning through the article here, so this species they have found a lot of similar type creatures of these in this same spot in Scotland, and they believe it's actually about 14 million years older than they previously thought. So in a lot of cases, they use things like carbon dating, radiometric dating, is what they used more on this one, because with this fossil, they never really determined like an accurate age. So now with the further testing, as technology has improved, they've done more testing. They're placing its age back to 346 million years ago. So it is now in a spot which is very significant, because in this range there's kind of a gap in the fossil record. And now with this species, with this new age, now fills some of that gap, which is significant because it helps kind of build more of the fossil record going back, which is crazy.
Yeah, having big blank spots in a false record is not good.
It makes it difficult.
Yeah. So now we're kind of adding new pieces to the puzzle, and eventually we'll actually get a full puzzle. But for now, we are still piecing it together. Alex, would you like to
Yeah.
continue, or do you have anything else to
Yeah,
add?
I'll continue, because a lot of this, they start getting into some like radiology and some geology. So what they did was they used zircon crystals, which are found in things like old lava flows that have hardened into a basalt rock, and they were lucky in this location because in this area, I think at one point there were some volcanoes before the different land masses had moved. And so as the mud flowed down from the volcano, all that lava and debris eroded the sediment that contained those zircons and would have swept it into those lakes where these early tetrapods were found. And the scientist who published this, who led this, sorry, Hector Garza, he x-rayed 11 rock samples from this site to extract the zircons from that rock that surrounded the fossils that they dug up. And then what he did after that was conducted a uranium lead laser dating. So what it is like how long uranium decomposes into lead. Uranium isotopes that are unstable eventually decomposes down into lead, which is typically considered one of the heaviest, most stable elements of that size. Like it's a very lead is a very stable element for as big as it is. And with that decomposition, they can determine the age because it goes through like half lives. So to get into a little chemistry with it, that half life is how long the amount of time it takes for, say, if you have a 1 kilogram sample of uranium, is how long it would take half of that, so that half kilogram, to decompose into that lead. And they know what that dating is, or they have figured out through a lot of chemistry and math and stuff to get like pretty close to what that amount of time is. And with that, they were able to kind of determine the oldest possible age of these fossils because of the rocks that surrounded them. And initially, they had thought they were closer to 331 million years old. But now, as they've done more testing and improved testing, they've gotten it closer to that 346 million year age, with it being all the way up to 360 million years ago. Because once you start getting into that amount of time, the date ranges start to spread out because it's harder to get to pinpoint.
The accuracy of these like dating techniques and stuff kind of fluctuates further back you try to date. That's why like a lot of time, Alex said we use carbon dating, which is a very traditional method, and it's
Yeah,
very
it's
accurate up to
easy.
a point.
Yeah, it's easier to do. It's cheaper to do than some of this radiological dating. But yeah, after a certain time period back, it starts becoming much more difficult. And you have to take into factors like environmental factors, like how much of the carbon 14 isotope was actually present. And they have a rough idea, but there's always differences. And it's kind of like an average amount. Even now, like there's a certain amount of carbon 14 found in every living thing and non-living things that have any sort of carbon in them, and there is the possibility of having more or less, and you start getting into different factors that will mess with the date range, and the further back you go, the wider that, the more those factors will play. But it's cool. This is cool because it kind of shows, they said, like that gap, like kind of figuring out a little more like when these early land dwelling creatures started to make their way to the land, because they said doing different testing for all the rock and sediment around the fossils, they were able to kind of determine that at the time that these fossils were living, this species was living, it was like a tropical forest with active volcanoes, a toxic lake, probably from the volcanic gases or whatever, and it had a fairly diverse plant animal community. So if you want to discuss a little more, Tyler, I'm going to look and see where that fits into the geologic time scale.
300 some million would be kind of like pre-Mesozoic, so it'd still be
That would have 300 million. That'd have been like middle of the Paleozoic, so like right after the Devonian, mostly the Mississippian.
okay. So Carboniferous period.
Yes, so early Carboniferous period is the geological time frame that this would have taken place, which fits a lot because this is the point when you started seeing the explosion of a lot of plants on land. That's why Carboniferous, when you do that geologic time scale, this is where you start to see a lot of things like your coals, like
Yeah,
the different a lot of those very deep veins of fossil fuels. This is where that starts to show up in the rock layers, because before this you wouldn't have seen as much because most coal is from
these plants.
these plants because just the sheer abundance, and as they died, all that carbon settled into the sediment, and over time it got compressed into coal. So you get more of that, what we in the Rust Belt would refer to as anthracite coal, which is like the harder style coal, because it's been pressed for so long, and it's cleaner coal, air quotes, because it's still coal, but that's where a lot of that comes from.
All right, so that's gonna do it for today's article. Pretty interesting
Sorry,
stuff.
got a little
Alex got a little bit
long-winded.
long-winded. He was pretty excited about it,
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
but the article kind of gave you a little rundown. It helps us figure out more pieces of the puzzle
Yes.
of our like taxonomic tree through the use of various dating techniques, carbon dating, uranium lead dating, things like that. Very cool stuff. But we'll move on into our lesson today. As I stated earlier, we're talking about argentiniforms. A little bit about these guys. These are going to be your marine smelts, not to be confused with freshwater smelts, which live a lot of their time also in marine ecosystems. Alex has pulled up a picture of a
Just
Argentina
a
today.
generic marine smelt.
Pretty much, yep. So there's about overall between the couple groups we're talking about today, there's about 230 species within 60 genera. As I said, they're most commonly referred to as marine smelts, even though the freshwater smelts also live a lot of time in marine waters. These guys have their earliest fossils are fossils of the inner ears found in Japan, although there's later fossils that have been found in the US and Germany, also of the inner ear, which are called otoliths, is the term we're using for that. The otolith bones. They're typically smaller in color, smaller in size, silvery in color, as you can see in that picture. Those are centimeter markings, I'd assume.
Wood as well.
And we're getting up to this one's a larger one, kind of middle of the pack actually, because they grow about 25 centimeters. This one looks to be from tip of the snout to tip of the tail is about 15 centimeters in length. They have that silvery, sometimes a little bit darker in color, and they live in the bathypelagic zone. So this is the second from the top zone in like the water column of the ocean. So you have the pelagic zone up top. That's where all the sunlight comes in. Uh, Typically, some of your most biodiverse regions because of the phytoplankton and
Yeah.
things of that nature that live
That
towards the surface.
availability of the
Yeah,
sunlight.
but as you get down deeper, there's less sunlight penetration. So the things that live are typically more carnivorous. Although these guys are like these guys are the main food fish for a lot of larger predators in these waters. Some members have adipose fins, which are like when you think of adipose, they're like little extra bits of fin, and they have a physoclistus gas bladder, which means that it's only used for buoyancy. We've talked about some other groups in the past that they use their swim bladder to help with hearing with auditory senses. It kind of
As well as sometimes a little bit of breathing as well in
yeah
some of the really kind of special cases.
yeah. So these guys use their swim bladders specifically and only for buoyancy, which is the main purpose of the gas bladder. And what kind of separates these guys is the epibranchial organ, which is the cartilage and gill rakers of the fifth ceratobranchial, which is the fifth like gill slit, which has the same purpose of like a gizzard in bird species. They use it to like grind up the food that they ingest.
Which makes sense because as we get into some of the groups, our families, that'll make more sense
Right.
when you see what they eat.
Alex, you want to talk about our first family?
Yeah. Yes, sir. I can do that. So our first family is the family Argentinidae. They're very similar to the freshwater smelts, but they tend to possess smaller mouths. They can grow decent size, about 20 inches or 25 centimeters. There is one species, the greater Argentine, that can grow up to 28 inches or 70 centimeters. So some of them can get relatively 70 centimeters, 28 inches. I didn't think that seems like a big jump.
28 inches is 2 feet, over 2 feet.
Yeah. Huh. Okay.
No, it's just a massive smelt
No,
compared to the rest of them.
the first one is on 25 centimeters is not 20 inches, supposed to be 9.8.
Yeah,
inches. I think you
I
might
messed up my words.
been reading lower when you were getting your notes.
Yeah.
But so they tend to form large schools close to the seafloor. They feed primarily on small things, as they're not very large, like plankton, krill, very small cephalopods, other marine invertebrates. So this is where that epibranchial organ really comes into play, because these things tend to have a especially when you get like the plankton, krill, and the invertebrates.
They have some type of exoskeleton to
Yeah,
them.
yeah, some sort of like shell or exoskeleton. So this make allows them to kind of grind up that exoskeleton, and they can digest it more easily. These fish in this family are often processed into fish meal, which is a lot of times a critical food source in a lot of types of factory farms for livestock. Real easy way to get a lot of protein into their diet. And there are 30 combined species in a couple of the genera they have. Is one is Argentina, the other is Glossanodon.
Yeah,
Those
those are the only 2 genera
those are our
for
only
this
two genera.
family.
Okay.
They're cool, very cool. Our next family, though, is gonna be Bathalagidae. These guys are the deep sea smelts, and with them being a deep sea species, there's not really a lot of information to them.
They are freaky looking.
Yeah, they're a little bit freaky looking. What's your most deep sea animal, organisms? For whatever reason, the further down you go, the uglier you get. Like goblin
Yeah.
sharks and gulper eels,
Yes. They
gross.
are ugly.
But yeah, these guys are found in deep waters. Your top range is about 1,500 meters. There's a lot of species that live much, much deeper. Like the eared black smelt lives up to 20,000 feet or 6,000 meters below the surface. And these guys, similar to the other smelts, are typically that 10 inches, 25 centimeters in length. And they also feed primarily on plankton and krill. These guys are going to feed more on the zooplankton, but just because of where they live in the water column. And there's about 25 species and 9 genera. Many of those genera themselves are monotypic, only having one species within them.
So then our next family is the family Microstomatidae. These are known as the pencil smelts. So as you would guess, they have very slender bodies, and they tend to have large eyes and small mouths. So they live, it says kind of where they live in the water column. It doesn't really, oh, here it is, kind of that mesopelagic to the bathypelagic. So a lot of those deeper parts of the open ocean. So like that twilight zone into the midnight zone, which is why they would have the very large eyes, kind of collect as much light as possible when there's not a lot down there, so they can see. They're typically, their dorsal fin is located behind the midpoint of the body, as you can see in the image that Tyler has pulled up. Their dorsal fin is very far back. Pectoral fins are located along the sides of the body rather than more along the ventral surface of the body. And the lateral line extends all the way over to the caudal fin. So you can see in the image here, typically a fish, the end of the tail, like the meaty part of the tail ends, and then you have the rays of the fin. But in the image that Tyler has, that kind of meaty part of the tail is what separates the upper and lower aspects of the caudal fin. And they do not have spines on any of their fins, which is, I think, is fairly typical for the smelts. They tend to have softer fins. And there are 21 species in 3 genera. There's Microstoma, Nansenia, and Xenophthalmichthes.
It's pretty solid pronunciation, if I do say so.
I know, I'm doing good today.
That'll bring us to our last group of Argentiniform for the day. We're gonna go talk about the Opisthroproctidae. These guys are known as spookfish or barrel eyes. They are kind of smaller, deep sea creatures. Let's pull up a great picture. So if you can see in the Alex's image here, those big like lumps they have, those are their eyes or a part of their eye. So they typically have barrel-shaped tubular eyes directed upwards, but they can also go in the forward direction. There's typically three different body forms throughout these species. Kind of a stouter, deeper body form, which is found more commonly in the barrel eyes. The spookfish can either have a slender, elongated form, similar to that microstomatidae, not quite as pencil-like, and then even yet they have a more intermediate form that's kind of like a cross between that slender, streamlined body form and the stout.
There you go.
Yeah, that's kind of like your
More the spookfish.
yeah the spookfish type. And then if you can kind of combine the last two images, that's how you get like your third one, which is like slender but still kind of like robust. These guys have telescoping eyes protruding from their heads, enclosed in a dome of soft tissue. So as you could kind of see in that first image that Alex had, uh, kind of like it kind of looked like a jelly like flesh orb around the
Yeah.
eyes,
Here, I'll pull it back up.
and that's
Go.
to help with. So they kind of, it's believed they kind of scavenge off of like ctenophores, which if you remember from like way back when, those are like the comb jellies. So they're believed to like scavenge food off the comb jellies, and this is to that like fleshy stuff. Like the flesh there is supposed to like protect their face and their eyes from the what do they call it? The neophytes, the stinging cells.
I don't think like comb jellies don't sting.
Either way, their eyes have these large lenses and retina with high numbers of rods, but they completely lack the cone portion. So whenever you think of like a human eye, we have both rods and cones, and the cones help with color vision. So these guys are completely colorblind, but have really good vision,
They have really good
like depth vision.
black and white, and with that, that would give them good depth perception,
You're right.
especially with like that kind of telescoping barrel. And then having very large eyes helps them see well in those dark environments.
Yeah. They have a small, terminal, and toothless mouth. So that means that the mouth is like right at the edge of their whole face. It's small and toothless, which, as we talked about, that what did I call it? That specialty that they have with their epibranchial organ. That's what it is
Yeah.
in the notes. That helps them grind down their food, so they have no teeth. They can't chew to break it down, so they have to grind it with that epibranchial organ. Some species have some type of bioluminescence to them, where they can either have organs going along the ventral side of their body. This one, it's not exactly easy to tell just based off the image. And others can have kind of like a single organ in the rear. Like it's called the rectal pouch. They also have spinous fins, which are relatively small in comparison to the rest of the body, except for in their pectoral fins, which are very elongated and almost wing-like. This helps them to kind of stay level in their water column, since most lack a gas bladder entirely, which is different than almost every species we talked about so far in the in our little fish discussion. But they compromise by having those elongated lots of surface area to those pectoral fins to help them stay within the right level within their water column. And they can have a forked or emarginated caudal fin. I assume that emarginated means that like how the other smelts are, where the fleshy part
Like
like
separated,
separates it,
yeah.
while their dorsal fin originates over top of or just before the anal fin. And that's gonna do it for our Argentiniforms. We
Yes, sir.
do
I
have
mean,
another group to cover,
yep, another family that's kind of
rather small, kind of like a
yeah,
transition between this past group, not really this past group per se, but it doesn't fit with the next group we're going to talk about next week either.
yeah,
So we're going to
they're
throw it in here since next week's going to be a rather large episode.
yeah, they're kind of on their own. So this is the family Galaxidae. So this the Galaxiforms is the order that they fall into. They're kind of their own little slice of the phylogenetic tree. The primarily small freshwater fish, as you can see in the image Tyler pulled up here, that are found in the southern hemisphere, mainly southern Australia, New Zealand, southern Africa, a little bit in South America, like the Falkland Islands. The most common galaxid species is the common Galaxis, or Galaxius maculatus, is one of the most widely distributed, naturally distributed freshwater fish in the southern hemisphere. Typically cooler water species found at like temperate latitudes. There's really only one species that's like a subtropical species, so you find them a lot in those like upland rivers, streams, and lakes, that those colder waters. It kind of splits within the family if they are strictly freshwater, or some have a partially marine life cycle where the juveniles, the larvae, hatch in the river systems and then are kind of washed downstream towards the ocean and then return as the juveniles and then into adulthood. So it's kind of backwards from how salmon are, where they live their life in marine waters and then only return to the freshwater to spawn. A lot of these species are threatened by exotic salmonid species, particularly trout species, which prey on them because they are small, very prey-sized
I'm gonna
fish.
assume that that's an invasive problem,
I would agree.
because trout and stuff are voracious kind of predators.
Yes,
And
they
when you
are.
throw
They
them
are
into a
very.
place where they have no predators besides humans catching them for sport,
Yeah.
it just terrorizes ecosystems.
Yes. They are considered kind of a sister group to the Neotelostei, which are a
Hmm.
different type of bony fish, like the Percopsiforms, the cod, which
Yeah,
we have
lots of
not talked
Pokemon
about
that we're
yet.
gonna talk about in a couple
Yeah.
weeks, give or take months.
A relatively recently evolved group, kind of in the late Cretaceous, is where the oldest fossils are found. There are 50 species and 7 genera, spanning some of these genera are only found in certain areas. But they are pretty well widespread overall. Used a lot as bait fish, especially or as food fish for some indigenous tribes. A lot of times they are disregarded by anglers, being too small or because they're not trout, but they are quite often caught in fishing, usually just catch and release. But that is all I really have for these guys.
Uh, just real quick, the couple genera that we have for these guys are gonna be Aplochiton, Lovetia, Brachygalaxius, Galaxiella, Neoshane, and Paragalaxis. And they have anywhere from 2 to 30 some species within them. Obviously, the
Yeah,
largest group is going to be Galaxius.
yeah. And your smallest is Lovetia, which has just one species.
Yes. But with that, that's going to conclude today's lesson. We talked about Argentiniforms and Galaxids, or Galaxidae. We're going to move on into our reoccurring segments. We have our amazing species, which I'll go ahead and cover. Right now, today we're talking about the tequila. What is it? Splitfin. Yeah, I almost said split tail. That's right. So these guys aren't anything we talked about today. Unfortunately, I couldn't really find much information in terms of IUCN information on any of the things we talked about today. But this is a cool story. So the tequila splitfin is indigenous to a single lake within Mexico. I'd assume the state of
State of Jalisco, I believe. If that's the state, I'm not sure. West of Guadalajara.
yes. But anyway, it's endangered in the wild. Lives in one tiny little area by La Vega, which is a lake fed by the Rio Chapulimita. And we're on an increase here, so this is one of the first times we talked about having an increase in population because there have been captive populations in Europe. I want to say Scotland, Ireland, like the United Kingdom area, where they have been breeding them in captivity. Granted, that's not exactly like it's breeding fish in captivity and releasing them in the wild is kind of a touchy subject because there's no like enrichment you can do for them that gets them ready for like
Wild.
the wild. Like in some larger scale mammals and stuff, you kind of can if you like have them on like a larger preserve or something like that. So it's still captive raised, but it has to do all of its stuff
For itself.
for itself. And your only like human intervention might be like
Medical
vaccines
care,
or
yeah.
healthcare and stuff like that. But we have started a uh, reintroduction program from the University of Morelia. But yeah, so funny thing, in 2013, this population was declared extinct in the wild, as it was only in these captive bred areas. But since then, in I believe 2016 was when we started this reintroduction program. So slow progress, considering we went from extinct to 80 individuals in the wild, but that's still better than zero.
Yeah, and it looks like to really achieve a lot of that, they went through a lot of effort to eradicate as much of the invasive species in that area as they could. And while they couldn't totally eradicate them, they reduced them to a point where these fish are more able to thrive. And they've done a lot of things to try to make the lake a little better. There was a lot of degradation that occurred from the construction of the La Vega Dam, and because of that, it kept it kind of restricted a lot of the endemic of these fish to kind of the headwaters.
Yeah, and it looks like a lot of these like invasive species that have been introduced are from the aquarium trade and kind of people like not wanting to care for them anymore and just dumping them.
Which makes a lot of sense.
So we're talking like cichlid species, swordfish tails, mollies, things of that nature, which is weird because it's not like game fish. It's just
Yeah.
which I guess would make sense. Other things that play a factor besides invasive species and dams are your normal typical water pollution from agriculture and like urban areas, as well as like livestock and ranching. I assume that's because of like uh
Runoff, probably.
what's it called? Depasteurize it. Nah, that's not the right word. Is it? Where the cows and stuff eat all the grass, so like there's no roots or anything to hold.
Desertification?
That's the word. I was close. Deep.
Yeah, you were right there. You had the right idea.
Yeah. So the dirt just kind of runs off and creates poor water quality, as well as human interactions. But this is a success story. I think I've only talked about a success story like one or two other times for amazing species. But we're doing great on this one. It shall continue to increase based off of human intervention. At
Yes,
least
sir.
that's my thought process. Alex, what do you have for our most wanted?
Absolutely. So our most wanted for this week, it's kind of actually appropriate that Tyler brought up the ctenophores when talking about the barrel eyes, because our most wanted for this week is a ctenophore. It is a comb jellyfish, specifically the sea walnut or warty comb jelly. It is Nemeopsis ladii. It is a tentaculate ctenophore native to the western Atlantic coast, but it has been established in areas in Europe and Western Asia, especially in areas like the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and then as well more recently in the North and Baltic Seas. And while these guys are very small, they are voracious carnivores, eating a lot of zooplankton, small crustaceans, as well as the other native comb jellies, eggs, and fish larvae. Uh, it does have some predators like birds and larger fish, but it is the big problem with these is they're capable of self fertilization, which means that they can fertilize their own eggs and lay eggs because they are hermaphroditic. Um, and they can carry about 150 eggs at a time along each of what is called the meridional canal, which does not say specifically what that is. Um, but they can produce as many as 10,000 eggs from a large specimen, so a large one of these, especially in areas where they have abundant prey. It is quite quite a ready spawner, and they can start producing eggs as early as reaching about 15 millimeters in length, which is relatively small because they have a maximum body size of about 12 centimeters in length, or about 5 inches, and they're about 2.5 centimeters in diameter, about an inch, as well as they tolerate a wide variety of salinity, temperatures, different water qualities. And they are sometimes called the immortal jellyfish because it can actually undergo reverse development, meaning that it can actually go back to like a previous life cycle stage. So they can live just about forever because they have a way to just go back and like basically de-age themselves. So that's the other issue is that they don't really just die on their own. But they do move relatively slowly, which is why they're called the sea walnut. But yeah, first introduced into the Black Sea in about the 1980s, and then Caspian Sea in late 90s, and the North and Baltic in the mid 2000s. Most likely from the ballast of ships, which is where a lot of things like this size reach those far away areas. And they've, especially in the Black Sea in the late 80s, they found as many as 400 specimens per cubic meter of water, which is about 10 per cubic foot. And those were in those like optional conditions, which is very much very high, which it did at least cause some population drop because they reached that carrying capacity. It caused significant population drops, and even a lot of commercially important fish like the anchovy and grallias and crassulus. So it's quite a problem, but they were able to do some biological control from another comb jelly, the Barrow ovata, which they've had some success kind of getting a relatively stable predator prey dynamic, but that it hasn't gotten to the point where they've reduced these fish or these comb jellies to a point where they're not as much of a problem. It's there's still quite an issue, even though they are relatively narrowly distributed. It is still quite an issue in the areas that it's found.
Right. Anything else to add?
That's all I got for these guys.
All right, I'll take us into our encyclopedia, our ecology encyclopedia for today. We covered last episode, we covered the water cycle. So today we're going to cover the carbon cycle.
Yes, sir.
So if you do not know, these various cycles are how we kind of like recycle various necessary chemicals and compounds into the circle of life, we'll say. Think of it like this. Alex put up a graph. He can kind of explain some of these things.
Yeah, so especially when you're looking at carbon, of course, carbon is the element that is really the basis of all life on Earth. So it really starts a lot with like the CO2 that is in the atmosphere, and plants will intake that carbon dioxide, and that is what they use to make the sugars that then our herbivores eat, which you can see a little bit in the animals that they've shown in the image I pulled up here. And then, of course, as you go through the food levels, that carbon is transferred to those different food levels. But eventually, everything either has to excrete what it's eaten or it dies. And a lot of those waste products and those dead organisms get recycled back uh, into the earth. It becomes what is known as like that leaf litter or like the organic layer of the soil. And then over time, it can eventually become like fossils and fossil fuels, like your coals, oils, natural gas, which are all carbon based. And then at that point, that is typically considered a storage, like a very long term storage. It kind of just holds all that carbon down there until we, as humans, come and dig that up and then burn it for our cars, power, whatever we're doing with it, generating plastics, heating our homes, and that carbon dioxide is then released back into the atmosphere, as well as when the animals and plants all go through their respiration
Respiration. Yep.
process, they release carbon dioxide, and that's kind of how that cycle continues. And there's just the sheer amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere is why this is not why the cycle really doesn't get broken. But that's kind of where the problem when we start talking about things like climate change and greenhouse emissions is because of the amount of these carbon-based molecules that are being released into the atmosphere is not it's beyond what the natural cycle of the planet is, but that's a topic for
And
another
there's
day.
there's a lot of minute details that happen in terms of like other ways that carbon is stored.
Yeah.
One of the largest carbon sinks is the oceans.
Yes.
That's not exactly covered in this graph, but basically the ocean is capable of gathering CO2 from the
Yeah.
atmosphere and
But
kind of
if you, yeah, the easiest way to describe that is either like things like algae and aquatic plants will take it in either from the water, or if they have a little bit, if they're on the surface, they can get it from the air, as well as when you get waves forming, it kind of captures some of that, and when um, the air brings it into the water, and then the carbon typically converts into like a carbonic acid or like a bicarbonate molecule, which is a little chemistry, and it's kind of stored in the water, and that's where you get ocean acidification, is because there's a lot of carbon being stored in the oceans. But that's another big sink for a lot of that carbon, because the ocean will take it, and of course it's a balance. It'll take a bunch in, it'll release a bunch, all in that same wave action. Um, and as well as things like plants, especially long living plants like trees, will intake and store a lot of carbon in the wood. But over time, as with a lot of other things, eventually that does decay or is burnt or whatever it is, and that CO2 is released back into the atmosphere.
awesome. That's a little basic explanation of the carbon cycle.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like little minute details that we could go into, but we don't want to like confuse the listeners here.
Yeah, we don't want to confuse and bore you too much.
But so that's gonna kind of conclude today's episode. As always, if you're new here, make sure to follow us on our social medias at Life Complete Story on Instagram, TikTok, on those two platforms. Follow us on Facebook at Life the Complete Story, on Spotify at Life the Complete Story, and on YouTube at Life the Complete Story. I try to get these episodes out on a semi-weekly basis.
As often as we can.
Within 3 days of recording, because typically we record on Friday or Saturday, and I try to get them up on Sunday, if not Monday. And send us an email at lifecompletestory@gmail.com if there is something you want us to talk about that doesn't quite fit into our little comment sections on YouTube or Spotify. We were talking before the episode about because I haven't looked at our analytics in a while. You guys are doing amazing.
Yeah, we really appreciate all you folks that are listening. It means a lot to us, because this is really a kind of a passion project for the two of us. Obviously, we're not in this to become professional podcasters and everything. We both still have day jobs that's what we normally do, but we do this because it's something we really enjoy and we want to share it with you guys.
It's
So we're glad you're listening.
Yeah, we looked at our analytics. I don't think I've looked at them since March. We were floating around 200-ish all-time views, and
But again,
I popped in right before we recorded while Alex was finishing up his last bit of Most Wanted and everything, and we doubled that in the past 2 months. And
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for helping out with that. But we're gonna go ahead. We'll end it there for you guys this week. Next week we'll be talking about salmon, pike, and
Ooh,
trout.
that's gonna
Alice's
be
favorite.
a beefy one. That's gonna be a big one. So, but as we say at the end of every episode, keep on learning, learn something new. You'll never know what you find interesting.